Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Here we are for part 2 of the video on energy systems. Hello. In the first video, we talked about the chemical reactions that help us convert glucose into ATP. And remember, ATP is the fuel source for the muscle. So we spent all that time talking about, well, there's this grouping of chemical reactions called the creatine phosphate system. That's what our muscle cells get ATP from first, for about 10 seconds. Then we move on to an anaerobic metabolism, which is another set of chemical reactions that gives us ATP for another 30, 40 seconds. But then, of course, if we want to get extended energy beyond that, we begin to rely on aerobic chemical reactions. So those were all talking about chemical reactions to provide ATP. ATP is our usable energy. But what can we use to form ATP? I just peeked ahead. Please forgive me. In other words, the common thought is, well, we convert glucose into ATP, which goes into the muscle. But we can also convert glycogen, which is stored glucose. We can convert fat into ATP. So remember, ATP is the usable energy. Our muscles, in order to go, need fuel. ATP is that fuel. What we convert into ATP is either carbs or fat, to a much smaller extent protein. So let's talk about these nutrients. What nutrients do we deliver to the muscles that then convert into ATP? Here's our list, baby. Number 1, we use blood glucose. So we're going to convert all these into ATP. But what fuel are we going to give the muscle? What nutrient are we going to give the muscle to then form ATP? Well, number 1, we use what's most easily available. And that's the glucose floating right by the muscle in the bloodstream. Once we go through a lot of that and we need more, then our muscles will begin to break down glycogen. Now, I know it can be a little tricky with the words, but you got it. There's glucose, that is the monosaccharide, but we can also store glucose. It's really important. We bring in a big meal. We eat a big bowl of pasta. We don't need all that glucose in the blood right away. It would just be overloaded. So what we do is we keep some of that glucose in the blood, but then we store some of that glucose for later. And the storage form of glucose is glycogen. This is really important. These are huge energy sources. We have a ton of glycogen. Not really a metric ton, but we have a lot. Make sure that you know where we store glycogen. It's really convenient because we store 2/3 of all of our glycogen right there in the skeletal muscle. So we have stored energy right there. All we have to do is grab it and break it down back into glucose. The remaining 1/3 or so of our glycogen or stored sugar, we store in the liver. No big deal. We can break down that glycogen in the liver into glucose. Then the bloodstream can carry the glucose to the muscles. We have multiple ways to get these nutrients to the muscle. And then, of course, we love to burn fat, the triglyceride that is stored as adipose tissue. Okay, that's what our cells will go to in order. Ultimately, we tend to be burning a combination of all of them. Shorter activities, we're going to be burning more glucose and glycogen. As the exercise activity gets longer, we start to burn more fat. Good stuff, everyone. Same slide. I'm just trying to really drive a point home. Here's a fancy graph. I'm not going to ask you to know this fancy graph, but I show this to you. This comes right from the Jake and Droop textbook. I show this to you because research backs up what I'm saying. I'm not just making up stuff. As the exercise duration is shorter, we use less fat and more glycogen and glucose. But as the duration goes on, we start to burn more fat. So everything you need to know is right down here. At shorter durations, we're burning more of carbohydrates in the form of glucose and then stored glycogen that we have to break down. But as the duration of the activity goes longer, we tend to burn more fat. That's all we're saying. I'm just giving you the proof, the data. So we can combine what we had before, and now we're adding the nutrient. We know that the goal for all three of these is to produce ATP to give into the muscle. At the very beginning of exercise, particularly when it's really high intensity, like this weightlifter dude, we're going to be using blood glucose. And then through these series of chemical reactions, we convert that glucose into ATP, which goes to the muscles. Then we begin to break down glycogen. And that glycogen gets broken down into glucose, which then, through these chemical reactions, again forms ATP, which goes to the muscle. For our longer duration activities, we're still going to be utilizing carbohydrates, but now we can tap into some of that fat. And through these chemical reactions, we again convert it into buku ATP. And it's a spectrum, which means that we can go up and down. Really important review here, really good slide. Hope you're listening. I've already said this, I'm just making a point of it. We're usually burning a combination. At the very beginning of exercise, we can only burn glucose. I'm saying like the first 5 seconds. You don't have to know that number, but it just gives you an idea. Like at the very, very beginning, we can only burn glucose because it's right there and it's quick. But as we continue to exercise, we'll start to burn glycogen and then fat. What we're going to find, and I like this number better, after about 45 minutes of continuous exercise, that's when we're really going to start to burn large amounts of fat. I'm going to add this as a qualifier. We burn fat sooner. I mean, sure, you're exercising for 15 minutes in a duration, you're going to burn a little bit of fat. But I'm talking about large amounts of fat. We don't get to burn large amounts of fat until we're exercising about 45 minutes continuously. Please know that number. Remember, I talked about this in our first chapter when we did the review. Yeah, you remember. We reviewed the structure and function of carbohydrates, fats, and protein. Remember, protein, we like to use protein for structure to our muscles, to our skin, tendons and ligaments, hair, nails. We like to use protein to form chemicals that are really important, enzymes, hormones, neurotransmitters, antibodies, hemoglobin that carries oxygen on red blood cells. We only burn protein for energy as a last resort. Only, I'd like you to know this number, even though it's not red. I'm putting it in red now. Usually, we only want about 10 to 15% of all of our energy coming from the nutrient protein, which means 85 to 90%, we want to be utilizing carbs and fat. If we start to burn more than that protein, it's going to take away from protein's other functions. So if we're not giving the body enough carbs or fat, and we're forced to burn more protein for energy, that's going to take away protein's ability to build muscle. So you could literally be tearing down your muscle to provide that protein as fuel. And as an athlete, we don't want that. Okay, I'm going to skip that. Don't worry. Alrighty. So some quick words on measurement. So this is all fine and well. Talk about how our muscle cells get energy. They produce ATP using such and such chemical reactions, and we convert we form ATP from carbohydrates, whether it's blood glucose or stored glucose as glycogen, or we can form ATP from fat, and we only form ATP from protein in a small amount. Well, let's talk about measuring some of this. Alrighty. We are going to talk about something called, well, we already talked about it. We talked about RER, didn't we? Yes, we did. I believe we did. I teach so many classes, sometimes I get confused. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work backwards. I went ahead a couple slides, so hopefully you can follow along. So make sure that you know of something called the respiratory exchange ratio, RER. RER is equal to CO2 that we produce during exercise divided by the O2 we produce during exercise. And what this number will tell us is what nutrient we're burning for energy. So the RER or RQ, we're going to use these interchangeably. Technically, the actual formula is the RER, whereas whatever we get as a result is called the respiratory quotient, because the quotient is the answer we get from division. But we're going to use RER and RQ as the same, basically. Dividing those gases while we exercise, if we're able to quantify them, that RQ tells us what our muscles are burning for energy. Isn't that pretty? That's pretty rad. Just by taking those gases, we're able to know, well, at that point in time, are our muscles burning 90% carbs, 10% fat? Are they burning 80% carbs, 20% fat? We have the research. At an RQ of 1.0, you are burning 100% carbs. So at the onset of activity, the RQ will likely be 1. 100% carbs. As we go down, an RQ of 0.85 means you're burning a 50-50 ratio. 50% carbs, 50% lipids. If we go even lower to an RQ of 0.7, we are burning 100% lipid. Make sure you know these three numbers. Pretty cool. Good. I'm pausing for effect to make sure you really get it. Now, as I go back, how is this possible? So if I were to know what nutrients our muscles are utilizing for energy, because that's what this means, nutrient utilization. That just means what nutrients are our muscles burning for energy? We just talked about it. We can do the RER or RQ, the CO2 produced at a given point in time divided by the O2 produced. If our RQ is 1.0, it means we're burning all carbs. If it is 0.85, 50% carbs, 50% fat. 0.7, 100% fat. So how is it that gases give us that information? Because those gases, the oxygen that we consume and the CO2 that we breathe out, they are related to the amount of ATP our muscles are using. Because not only do our muscles need fuel, so for a muscle to work, it needs a whole host of things. I mean, for a muscle to work, it needs a nerve impulse going into it to tell it to contract. We've already established that for a muscle to work, it needs some kind of fuel, So we take carbohydrates or fat and convert it into ATP, and that's like the fuel. But something else that our muscles need to contract is oxygen. It's just another ingredient that it needs. So therefore, because the muscles need both oxygen and fuel, they are related. When our muscles are working hard, we inhale and exhale more gases. I mean, when you exercise, doesn't your respiratory rate go up? The number of times you breathe in and out per minute? Of course. Why? Have you ever just stopped to think about that? Why do I breathe heavier when I exercise? Because your body's trying to bring in more oxygen, because the muscles need it. So when a muscle's working, we bring in more oxygen. And as a result of bringing in more oxygen, as a result of producing ATP as a fuel source, we produce CO2 that has to be breathed out. And of course, when our muscles are working harder and we're exhaling and inhaling more gases, that can tell us something about the nutrients that we're burning. At a high intensity exercise, right, we're going to be burning more carbs. At a lower intensity exercise, we aren't going to bring in as much gas. We bring in less gas. We still have to bring in some, but we're burning more fat. So I basically already said this. You don't have to know that specific thing. All I'm saying is that we're able to determine what our muscles are burning for energy through using gas exchange, because that's related to what our muscles are burning for energy in terms of a fuel source. And collecting gas data is much easier than trying to collect data on what chemical reactions are happening in the muscle. So it's very beneficial. We talked about this. We talked about putting someone on a treadmill or a bicycle, stationary bike, putting that little apparatus over their mouth where we collect and analyze exactly how much oxygen comes in. We collect and analyze exactly how much CO2 comes out. The machine does the division for us and it spits out the RER. Okay? It also has to do with the differences in structure. I'm not going to ask you this specifically, but another thing that makes this relationship possible in terms of using gas exchange to tell us what our muscles are burning for energy, because carbs, fats, and proteins, when they're burned for energy, because they're chemically different, it will produce slightly different amounts of gases. So that's also a possibility, but I'm not going to really ask you about that. Okay. All right, cool. We actually have one of these, right? I mentioned this in our video for the previous chapter. We have a treadmill with a Met cart where we put this apparatus on someone. We have them run and walk. We collect the data, and we're able to see the RER. And we have it set to give us data every either 30 seconds or a minute. Pretty cool. I'm giving you an example here. So here we're giving data per minute. I'm not going to have you do any math on a quiz or an exam, but these are real numbers. So while someone is walking quickly, this number would probably be the amount of CO2 and O2 brought in if you're walking at a quick pace. Based on this number, we do 1,100 divided by 1,200, we get 0.92. And because 1.0 tells us we're burning 100% carbs, we're pretty close to that. So she's probably burning 90%, 90-something percent carbs. All right, so make sure that you know these numbers. At an RQ of 1.0, burning all carbs. I'm repeating myself over and over again. You should get this. When you get this on a quiz question or a midterm or a final question, you should be like, yeah, I got this. I know it. RQ of 0.85, the muscles are burning a 50% carbs, 50% fat mixture. RQ of 0.7, burning all fat. And then we already know when this is going to happen. This is going to happen more at the onset when you burn mostly carbs, because carbs are quick, right? As we begin to exercise a longer duration, we're going to burn more and more fat. So we would expect to see an RER go down as the duration of an exercise gets longer. Okay, we can make some other measurements. I am not going to ask you about these. If anybody out there is interested in exercise physiology or something like that, these are very important terms. We can also measure something called oxygen consumption. We can also measure something called oxygen debt. You do not need to know these, but I'm just telling you them because they're out there in the exercise phys world. Well, actually, we did talk about oxygen consumption. Didn't we say that RER was equal to the volume of CO2 we bring in per minute divided by the volume of oxygen we bring in per minute? Well, the bottom number there, that's the volume of oxygen we breathe in per minute. So I guess we already know that. Just another term to call it. There is this principle. You might hear it called oxygen debt. You might hear it called EPOC, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. This is a term that explains a phenomenon that anybody who's ever done exercise knows. Even after you finish exercising, doesn't your breathing rate stay elevated for a bit? In other words, when you stop your run, you all of a sudden don't go back to your resting heart rate. So our heart rate stays elevated and our respiratory rate stay elevated a bit even after we stop exercising. And the reason that is because we want to replenish our oxygen in our body. So we kind of run on an oxygen debt for while we're exercising. And then when we stop exercising, our heart rate and breathing rate stay high to replenish all that oxygen, replenish all the energy stores. I'm not going to ask you that, but this is just, like I said, terms that are common in exercise phys. All right, let's round out some odds and ends. Okay. So a common question is, well, what is the reason for fatigue? This is a great question. A lot of athletes would love to be able to really understand, why am I getting fatigued at that time? Because if you can understand that, you could probably do something about it and therefore improve your performance. Basically, there's all sorts of things that can contribute. Everyone wants to talk about buildup of lactic acid, and I'm sorry to tell you, the research doesn't necessarily show that lactate accumulation is positively correlated with fatigue. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So it's a much more complex puzzle to understand. Something that we do know, when our ATP production, when the muscle's ability to produce the usable fuel is equal to whatever the muscle demands are, then we're good. We're not tired. When our muscles can produce ATP as quickly as our muscle cells need it. In its simplest form, we become fatigued when our muscle demands on this side are greater than our ability to produce ATP. Now, why this is true, that's a harder question to answer. Because we know that the production of ATP involves so many factors. Oxygen, fuel, all those chemical reactions have to go properly. We have to have the right enzymes present. The temperature of the body can't be too high. The pH of the blood has to be in a certain range. So something is causing our ATP production to go down. Is it just lack of fuel? But in its essence, we become fatigued during exercise when our body is no longer able to bring in as much ATP as the muscle demands. Here are some explanations. So now we're looking at this. Why can't? Reasons why the body cannot produce enough ATP. Maybe we can't produce enough ATP because we just don't have enough fuel. Maybe the person didn't eat enough food that day. Maybe there's a problem with the digestion and absorption process. We ate the right food, but it's not properly absorbed. We can't get it to the bloodstream. Maybe there's something inhibiting chemical processes. Like I said, remember, our ability to convert glucose into ATP involves a whole host of chemical reactions. Maybe there's something that's disrupting those chemical reactions. Maybe the blood is too acidic and the enzymes aren't working. Maybe something like lactic acid, although we don't have clear data on that. Maybe there's a problem in the muscle. I don't have this one starred, so you don't need to know it, but potentially it could be a structural problem within the muscle, that maybe we have the fuel, but the muscle's not able to work. Something I do want to point out. One fallacy, something that we've been able to debunk with research. During long-term exercise, if you're looking at a marathon runner, just an easy example, fatigue from our research is not due to not having enough of this. We can store so much glycogen. So usually, from what we have been able to tell through our studies, it's not that there's not enough glycogen. These athletes have glycogen, but it could be a problem in getting that glycogen to the muscle and getting it converted into ATP. So maybe we have enough glycogen, but there's a problem with the chemical processes involved in breaking that glycogen down into glucose and then forming ATP. So it's not that we don't have enough glycogen. Sometimes we think, so I'd like you to know that, okay? What are some other possibilities down here, but you don't have to know these? Maybe, and again, it's likely not that we don't have enough fat either. Most of us have enough fat storage. Maybe it's just a delay in being able to get that nutrient metabolized, particularly fat. There's so many steps in fat metabolism. It just means that there's more opportunities for it to go wrong. Okay, last topic. What happens to these chemical processes with training? Now, this is an old slide of Haile Gebrselassie. He, as of 15 years ago, he had the world record for the marathon. And folks, that's 26.2 miles of running. He did it in 2 hours, 3 minutes, and 59 seconds. And if you do the math, that is running every mile at a pace of 4 minutes and 43 seconds per mile. Since then, we had a dude under some controlled environment, so it doesn't count as a world record. We had the dude get under 2 hours. Absolutely insane. I'm not going to ask you that, but it's just a feat of excellence. So what are some adaptations to our energy systems with training? Well, like everything else, exercise training is good, and our body begins to adapt. With training, we can produce more energy in our anaerobic pathways. Now, what I'm talking about is if we have resistance or weight training. So we're going to talk about adaptations that occur from weightlifting, and we're going to talk about adaptations that occur from endurance training. Well, not surprisingly, if you weight train, you're going to see more energy production in the anaerobic pathways. That's because weight training is an anaerobic activity. So when we do more anaerobic activity, our anaerobic energy systems get better by a little bit. Might be a second or two longer that we're able to produce from the creatine phosphate. When we have endurance training, we can actually increase the mitochondrial size and number. This is the part of the cell that produces energy. With endurance training, we can burn fats sooner. The fancy name for that is glucose sparing, but I think that may not be as easy to understand, so that's why I like to say we can burn fat sooner. And we like to burn fats. Gives us twice the yield of energy. And we decrease the rate of byproduct accumulation. So not only does muscle training make our muscles stronger, not only does muscle training help our heart to pump out more blood, but exercise training also leads to positive adaptations in our chemical processes. These changes can absolutely help performance. Now, let's not forget, genetics play a role. For example, I've done 4 marathons, and I will never, ever, ever, even if I quit my job and trained, I would never, ever, ever be even close to being as fast as Haile Gebrselassie in the marathon. So we kind of have a genetic window, I believe. And then within that genetic window, how much you train, how well you treat your body, allows you to hopefully maximize that better end of your genetic window. All right, folks, great chapter. I'll see you next time.